If you've been here for a little while, if you were here last summer, you'll remember that we did a series called Hymnos. And that series was on hymns, where we selected 8 hymns, and we preached through these hymns on what they said, what was their scriptural basis, their theology, when they were written, what they did for the church, all of that. And if you remember, the first hymn that we chose to start off and kick off the whole series of our hymn series was Amazing Grace. And the reason we chose that is because Amazing Grace is, I don't think it's an overstatement to say, probably the most popular hymn in the world, like of all time. I don't know if that's like a huge, gross overestimation, but it's super well known. I was watching this video the other day, and there's this series of videos on YouTube called 5 Levels, and it's where they get an expert in something, and they explain that thing at 5 different levels of difficulty, like increasing levels of difficulty. And this guy, this musician, was explaining harmony. And so they brought in this like kindergartner, and they were like, explain harmony to this kindergartner. And he was like, well, some notes sound like happy notes, but then you can add other notes with them, and it changes them and makes them into feel different things. And then they bring in like a high schooler, they bring in a college student who's majoring in music, they bring in a professional pianist, and then they bring in this like piano legend, and they talk about harmony. Anyways, through all of those explanations, all of those levels of difficulty that he's explaining harmony, he uses Amazing Grace as the example that he's playing on his piano, because everybody knows it. Like, everybody knows it. It's crazy. And the main line that the sort of whole song hangs on is the last line in the first stanza, which I'm sure you know it. It goes, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found, was blind, but now I see. And everything kind of hangs on that last resolution of the melody and of the idea of was blind, but now I see. And the idea, so that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. Was blind, but now I see. The idea of blindness and sight. What are those two things? How do we go from blindness to sight? What is that? And it's important to talk about because it's a really, really important theme in the Bible. It is one of only 3 kinds of miracles that are recorded in all 4 Gospels. The first being Jesus' own resurrection. The second being the feeding of the 5,000. And so Jesus healing the blind is really up there in terms of what he loved to do. Like, he would walk around and he was always healing blind people. That was like his thing. That was his gig. And for him, the reason is because it represented, he would do it physically, not only because he had pity on people, he wanted to heal them and to allow them to be more productive in society, but it also was a physical representation of a spiritual reality. It was a physical representation of a spiritual reality, this blindness to sight idea. And so we're going to be looking at it through a story in the book of John, chapter 9. So if you have your Bibles, you can take them out. We're going to be in the Gospel of John in the 9th chapter. If you don't have a Bible, you can raise your hand, and we have some people who can bring one to you. If you don't own a Bible and you want one, you can hang on to that. We would love for that to be yours to take home with you. So, the question is this when it comes to blindness and sight, this idea that was blind but now I see. I think we say that all day long, and that's a really common idea in the church. But something that we don't often think about is, what are we supposed to be seeing and how are we supposed to be seeing it? Was blind but now I see is this really nice, beautiful idea, but we don't often think about what it actually means and what it is that our sight now includes that it didn't before. Because it is a sort of theoretical saying. Most of us in this room have decent sight, not me, but a lot of you do. And so if it's not physical for us, like it was for some of the people in Jesus' day, then what is it spiritually? What am I supposed to be seeing And how am I supposed to be seeing it? And we're going to start in verses 1 through 2 of chapter 9. As he passed by, he saw a man blind from birth, and his disciples asked him, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" Let's stop there. Kind of a weird question, no? It might seem like a regular question, but it's a weird question because he was born blind, and the disciples asked Jesus if it was his sin that caused it. So, quick maths. How could he have sinned so that he would be born? I don't think time works that way. But here's the thing. Well, here's a quick trivia fact. The disciples are asking this because there was a very common belief in Greek culture at the time, which the Jews were encapsulated in, and in Jewish thought and idea, something called the transmigration of souls. Woo, SAT word. The transmigration of souls, which is the idea, that someone has a soul and they live in their body with that soul for a whole lifetime, and then they die, and then the soul goes into this sort of intermediate space, and then the soul again enters a new body and lives another life, and then perhaps it does it again. That body dies, and then it goes into this intermediate space, and then it comes back. And so that's an idea that's been rejected by Christianity. But it would have been common for someone to think this person was blind from birth. Perhaps they did something in their former life, and they sinned that required this punishment of being blind from birth. And so the disciples here are introducing an idea of judgment, or they're curious about judgment. And they're using this blindness as a way of understanding what judgment is. But there's a couple things that they have signaled of what they believe about judgment. The first is that there's a direct relationship between our sin and God's punishment. So the disciples thought that in some way there was a 1-to-1 ratio of someone sinning and God punishing. And so judgment to them is just punishment. And this is it might seem old-fashioned or antiquated or whatever, but I know that I've thought like this, and I think a lot of you might think like this, that if you ever make a mistake or do something wrong that you know is wrong, and in that moment you regret it or you feel shame. Some of you do things and you don't feel shame, and that's another story. But those of you who are trying to live a holy life, if you sin, a lot of times our next thought is, what is God going to do because of this? Have you guys had that thought, or is that just me? Couple, some no, some yes. If you haven't, good. Keep not thinking like that. But I think we get caught in this trap of, at the very least, if it's not a specific sin, it's just that we are a sinner, that we are afraid of the punishment of God because we haven't done the right thing, or that we will do the wrong thing, and that therefore we will be punished. And there's this direct relationship. It's like Job's friends. If you guys have read the book of Job, Job is this upright and righteous man, and all this calamity falls on him, and he loses all of his family and all of his wealth and everything. And his friends come and they say, essentially, you should think about the thing that you did that made God punish you in this way. And Job is like, where did that come from? Like, I don't think that's how this works. But it's that idea, and it's prevalent, and it can creep in really subtly. And the problem is that motivates us in fear. And that you've often heard that fear is a good motivator, often from like villains in movies. And to some extent, that could be true, that fear does motivate people to do things. But it only motivates us to do things that we don't want to do. The problem is that it's not good at keeping us from doing something that we do want to do. And so the idea that we shouldn't sin because we should be afraid of the punishment of God, or we shouldn't sin just because God will be angry at us, and that's what's going to keep us on the straight and narrow. That's what's going to keep us in holy living, is not going to be sufficient. Because fear, in terms of motivators, isn't going to keep us from doing things that we want to do, or that we might want to do. So that's a problem. So the first thing is that there's this direct correlation between punishment and judgment. That judgment equals punishment. And the second, and this is a little bit of an aside, but I think there's another way of reading this verse when the disciples ask, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? I think there is something of an obsession right now in popular culture with, in some sense, like evil people. This might sound weird, but track with me. Like there's a lot of shows coming out, particularly on Netflix. Like if you guys have heard of Evil Genius, there's this show about this like evil manipulative person who like pulled off this bank heist. There's this, John, I see you. There's this, there are all kinds of commercials for like the Ted Bundy tapes, which are, yeah, you guys have heard of this. Wow, huge murmur from the crowd. Struck a chord there, where they're publishing these conversations and these, I don't know, I haven't looked that much into it, but essentially documenting the life of Ted Bundy. And there are, yeah, that's just a really common thing right now, that we're so interested in what it is that make people so wretched and so depraved. And this is something that I've been thinking about for a long time. I promise we'll get back on track, but I've been thinking about this. It's interesting. That if you look at someone like that, someone, and maybe you can think of someone who you know or someone who you've seen. I feel like you don't have to walk around downtown San Diego for too long to find somebody who can't meet your gaze without being overcome with anger at you for nothing, just because you exist. That sometimes there are people who have just become their own judgment, in a sense. That instead of judgment being upon them, they are now the judgment, because their soul is so twisted and their heart is so dark that they almost can't get out, that they are almost beyond reaching. And I've been thinking for so long about what the deal is. How does that happen? Like, to what extent is it their responsibility or is it their fault? And to what extent is it, I don't know, their parents' fault or their environment? And so I think another way of reading this verse, the second verse, is who bears responsibility for the pitiful state of a person? Is it the environment or is it the individual? Because that's kind of what they're asking, right? Was it something else's fault, their parents in this case? Was it something else's fault that made them the way they are? Or is it something they did, that they choose? And therefore, are they bearing the full weight of responsibility? And it's a tough question. It's like, to use a silly example, have you guys heard this saying where a parent puts a glass of milk on like the very edge of a table, and then a kid, like in front of a kid who's sitting there, and the kid knocks it over, and it's like, well, whose fault is it? Like they put it on the edge of the table, but the kid chose to like knock it over, that kind of thing. Except in this case, there's a little bit more stakes because it's like your soul. So maybe like you have a kid next to you, and someone puts milk on the table in front of you both, and the kid knocks it over, and the milk goes all over you, and you're like, well, whose fault is it that I'm like this? Because, you know, I don't know. It's a weird metaphor, but you guys kind of get where I'm going with it. But our tendency is that we ask, what is this for? When something goes wrong, when there's a burden to be borne, whether it's blindness, or whether it's a loss, or whether it's a difficult friendship, or whether it's something terrible that happens in your family. When there's something that seems like judgment or punishment, we ask, along with the disciples, what is this for? Or who bears the responsibility for this? And Jesus gives us somewhat of an answer. Well, he does give us an answer. We're going to read it, but we're going to come back to it. Jesus says this in verses 3 through 7. Jesus answered, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. As long as I am in the world, I am the light of the world." Having said these things, he spit on the ground and made mud with the saliva. Then he anointed the man's eyes with the mud and said to him, "Go wash in the pool of Siloam," which means sent. So he went and washed and came back seeing. So this is a pretty incredible and weird thing to happen, right? He makes some mud with his spit in the dirt and he anoints the guy's eyes. He goes and washes them and he comes back and they're clean. This is kind of a long story. If we were all in my lecture hall, we would read the whole thing. We're not going to read the whole thing. But there's some really good pieces at the end. So I'm going to summarize what happens next, because this is just first little section. He's blind just like that. So we know that the meat of the story is coming later, because we're only a couple verses in to the story and he's already healed. So what happens next is he gets healed and there's a bunch of confusion about who he is. So the next, 6 or 7 verses are people being like, is that the guy who's blind, like forever, since he was born and has been begging for the last however many years on the side of the road? Because he's seeing. Like he's got sight. And people are like, no, it's not the same guy. It's a totally different guy. It couldn't be the same guy. Some people are like, no, I'm pretty sure that that's the guy. He's been here every day for the last however long I've been here. So there's all this confusion about who he is. And so they go to ask him. And they ask him, they said, who are you? Who are you? What are you doing? And he tells them, he explains to them what happened. He said, there's this guy, Jesus, and he came and he anointed my eyes and he healed me. And now I can see. And I don't think they like that very much, so they bring him to the Pharisees. And the Pharisees ask him the same thing. They say, what happened to you? And he explains the whole thing for a second time. He says, oh my gosh, I just told a bunch of people this. Okay, so what happened was, and he goes through the whole thing. He was blind, he was begging, Jesus comes and heals him. And then the Pharisees don't like his explanation either, because it makes Jesus seem like a pretty cool guy. I shouldn't have said it that way. It makes Jesus seem like an important deity, and that frustrates them. Sorry, be more precise. That frustrates them because to the Pharisees, there is only one God, and it is the God of Moses, and Jesus isn't that person according to them. And so they fetch this man's parents, and they ask his parents, is this your son? What happened to him? And the parents say, all we know is that he was blind and now he sees, but we don't really know what happened, but he's of age, so you should ask him. They kind of pawn it off. And they say, just ask him, because they were afraid. And so the Pharisees go get him again, and they say, tell us what happened to you. And he's had enough of it. He's like, I'm over this. I've told you so many times, like, are you trying to be his disciple? Like, do you want to follow him? Because of how many times you're asking me. And they get really upset at that. And because they're upset, they start to ridicule him. And that's where we're going to pick up. So they start to ridicule him. We're in verse 32 now. I feel like maybe it would have taken just as long to read the whole thing, now that I'm thinking about it, but that's okay. You can read the whole thing later. It's a really good story. There's so much here. Verse 32. So this is after he told them for the second time, and they get frustrated. And this is, we're starting where the Pharisees are talking to the man who was healed. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. Oh, I'm sorry. I was wrong. This is the man born blind speaking. I apologize. So the healed man is speaking. Never since the world began has it been heard that anyone opened the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. They answered him, you were born in utter sin, and you would teach us. And they cast him out. Jesus heard that they cast him out, and having found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? He answered, and who is he, sir, that I may believe in him? Jesus said to him, you have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you. Basically, it's me. I'm the guy. He said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. Jesus said, for judgment I came into the world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind. This is where I want us to camp out for a little while, because this is really important. Jesus is bringing back this idea of judgment that the disciples initially brought up with their initial question, which was, who sinned that this man was born blind. And so Jesus says, "For judgment I came into the world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." And what he does is he redefines what judgment is. And what he says is, the thing that you guys thought was judgment, where you do something wrong and bad things happen, the punishment of wrongdoing or the punishment of unbelievers or sinners, that's not all that judgment is. What he's saying is that he restores to order what was disordered and confused. He's restoring to order what was disordered and confused. Because here's what happened. This man was born blind, and his blindness put him in a position of humility. It cultivated humility in him, and it's that humility that caused him to deserve his sight to be given to him from the Lord. And it's because it's those who are humble and lowly who are the ones who are in the correct posture to see God. And it's a wonderful representation, because when you are blind, you are, no matter how much you might want to deny it, dependent on someone or something else. For a lot of us, we can go throughout our life and we can do and act and see as we please. But someone who is blind is dependent on someone or something, and they know that it's not all up to them. They know that they must reach out to something else, something outside of themselves, that it's not all revolving around them. And it's that attitude that Christ comes to deliver. It's in that attitude that someone can see anew, that Christ delivers sight and knowledge of himself to. And this is what Jesus means when he says that those who do not see may see. That someone who knows that the world is so complex and confusing and difficult that they can't control it. They know that they don't have the answers, and because of that, they may receive them. So that's his first idea, that Jesus' judgment in balancing that which was unbalanced is to give sight to those who were blind, that those who are in this posture of blindness, of humility to the world and to God and to others, that they are ones who receive sight. But there's a second part to this judgment. He goes on to say in, the end of verse 39, and that those who see may become blind. So there's this inverse. So that those who see may become blind. And what he's talking about here, the people who see are those who are seeing with purely human vision. What he means by people who see are people like the Pharisees, who think that they know everything, that they can do anything, and that what they say goes, essentially. They only see what they want to see. They're concerned more about their reputation than the truth. And they do think that they can see everything already and be the judge of all things. But Jesus says that it's his presence that reveals to them that they don't, or that they can't. Because the Pharisees don't know what to do with him. And if you go up and read a little bit in the story, the part of the story that we didn't get to, we see that the Pharisees ask him so many times what has happened and who he is and what he's doing, because they can't believe it, because it's something that was outside of their control, outside of their knowledge, and they just can't get a grip on it. And so in that sense, it's a veil over their face, that there's now something that's confronting them that they don't know, that they can't know, and they're unwilling to know, because they're not in the posture of the blind man. They're not in the posture of the beggar. And so the light of Jesus blinds those who already see. And I know that I can think of someone who feels like they already know everything. And I suspect you can too. But consider for a moment that maybe it's you. That maybe as easy it is to see others who think they know everything, to contemplate how easy it is for us ourselves to have an idea or an opinion or to be confronted with something and to think that just because we think something or just because we know something, that it must be right. And I think that when it comes to sight and blindness, at least spiritually or how we view the world, that we've really been tricking ourselves. And when we've heard this saying, was blind but now I see, this great last line of that stanza of Amazing Grace, that we've been tricking ourselves. I think we've been tricking ourselves with a cheap human version of vision, that when we say, was blind but now I see, that we are seeing only ourselves. And we think that sight, here's the thing. When we think of being given sight by the gospel, I think that we think it just means seeing Jesus. Does that make sense? Like just seeing who he is or like hearing what he did. And that's the sight that we're given. That previously we couldn't see because we didn't know who Jesus was. And now we've been given sight because we do know who Jesus was. And that's all that it is. And we think that because we can know the answers to the questions that our small group leaders ask, or because we go to chapels basically every day, or because we go to Awanas every Sunday, or because our whole family were Christians, and that because we know all these things and we can see who Jesus is, or we know of him, that that's the sight that this verse is talking about. But there's something else in this story. It's what the Pharisees respond to Jesus with. After he says, "For judgment I came into the world, that those who do not see may see, and those who see may become blind." This is verse 40. Some of the Pharisees near him heard these things and said to him, "Are we also blind?" And I don't want you to read that question as a genuine question. It's hard to see in the text, but when they say, "Are we also blind?" it's better to understand this saying more as, we're not blind, are we? It's kind of, it was a way for them of sort of mocking him, saying, we're not blind. There's no way we're blind. Number one, we can actually see. And number two, we know the law of Moses. So there's no way that we could be blind. And Jesus said to them, verse 41, "If you were blind, you would have no guilt. But now that you say, 'We see,' your guilt remains." And so again, it's this idea that I can see Jesus rather than through Jesus I have sight of all things. Let me say it another way. Jesus is within my vision instead of Jesus is my vision. Does that make sense? Like if I say something is within my vision, like if I stand here and I look out and I say, this camera is in my vision, or, whoa, sorry, that was a fourth wall thing. Or I say that Sky is in my vision, or Enoch is in my vision. It means that I can see them, but they're amongst a bunch of other stuff. There's all these other things in the room, and they're this little part of what I see that's within my vision. And I think that we treat Jesus the same way sometimes. That we can say, oh, we've been given vision. We've been given vision for Jesus, that we can see him now. But we place him alongside a bunch of other stuff that we already think we see. And it's not Jesus that makes us see new things. It's not seeing all things through Jesus. It's just seeing Jesus alongside of a bunch of other stuff. A bunch of other stuff that we've already figured out, a bunch of other stuff that we already know, a bunch of other stuff that we've already decided that Jesus doesn't really have a part in. That I already have all things. I've got my school, I've got my friends, I've got my family, I've got whatever I've got. I've got my philosophy or my political ideology, I've got whatever. And the only thing I was missing was like a little spiritual boost. And so, because I know who Jesus is now, I can see him like, check the last thing. I've got it all now. And we think that we can do or think however we want because we are lucky enough to know Jesus. We're lucky enough to have been told about him, lucky enough to live in America. And that he was just the missing puzzle piece to something else that we had already had. And I think if we are in this place, then we have to become blind again. And it's a difficult thing to think that we have to become blind. But it's a knowledge that Socrates, I think, knew. Sorry, this is a little bit of a tangent, but you guys know Socrates, right? You guys, you go to school. Socrates. It's Socrates who is considered the wisest man, and he says because he knew that he knew nothing. It's that kind of thing. It's I know nothing apart from Jesus. That it's not just him as a part of my vision, but it's him in everything, and through him, everything else. It's that kind of idea, that I know nothing apart from this one thing. For Socrates, it was that I know nothing. For us, it's that we know who Jesus is, that we know the person and character of Jesus and God. And so, to circle back, if we think that we see, I think we might still have a tendency to think like the disciples and think about judgment as punishment, right? But I think that it's something else. I think instead of thinking of responsibility as whose fault it is, we think about it as pick up your cross. We think about responsibility for something as pick up your cross. Jesus said, to circle back to the beginning of the story, verse 3, Jesus said, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day." So what is it that we're supposed to see in this new divine vision? What are we supposed to see then? If it's not everything else in Jesus as a little part, what are we supposed to see? I think we're supposed to see that our burdens are not there for us to discover who to blame. Because that's all that the disciples saw when they saw this blind man. Who's to blame for this? And it's the same way that I thought about all of these people. In the same way I think popular culture thinks about these evil people that we like to study. Who's to blame for this? Was it their decisions? Was it their environment? Was it their family? Who's to blame? But instead of thinking who's to blame, we think we can orient ourselves differently toward burdens or toward what has gone wrong, the ways that we might feel defective. They are there so that the works of God might be displayed in me as I conquer them, if I have these things, if I carry these burdens. Instead of finding who is at fault, I can think, these are here that I might pick up my cross, voluntarily take on the responsibility of them, and in overcoming them, show the glory and work and majesty of God. And so, if you are carrying a burden, or you feel defective, or you're angry, or maybe if you feel nothing at all, because I have definitely had moments of that in my life where I just feel like I don't feel anything. Consider whether Jesus is within your sight, or if Jesus is your sight. Because if Jesus is within your sight, his presence might actually be making you blind. And I know that that's counterintuitive, but you might be thinking, with all these things that I have, with all of the difficulties that I'm encountering, or with maybe what I will encounter in the future, I keep coming to church and I keep talking to my Christian friends, and none of it is working. None of it is helping. I still just feel like the same old person. Maybe it's getting worse. Maybe you come here all the time. You come here every Sunday, but you're still burdened or hurt or angry or feeling nothing, and you're curious whether it's time to just call it in, throw in the towel on this whole church or Christianity thing because it doesn't seem to be helping. Well, again, maybe it is the sight of Jesus that is making you blind if you think that you see as the Pharisees do. So consider whether you might need to become blind like this beggar. And as the band comes back out, all I know is this. The stanza to that song, Amazing Grace, doesn't sing, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see Jesus too. Was blind, but now I see another thing also. Or was blind, but now I see a little bit more. The line is, Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Was blind, but now I see. You can't be given this sight if you are not first blind. And if you don't feel that you have ever been blind, or you don't feel that you can be in a posture of blindness, which is to say, dependency, humility on something that isn't you, then you might need to think about how you can get there. And I would encourage you to ask God. And so maybe that means for some of you, we're about to sing a song where the words are, you've given me life, you've opened my eyes. I love you, Lord. I love you, Lord. And I think this song was written to be a sort of praise and a sort of proclamation of joy that he has given me life and he's opened my eyes. But for some of you, instead of declaring that that has been true, some of you might need to pray that to God and ask him to do that, because maybe he hasn't yet. And maybe your seeing is actually making you more blind. Let's pray. God, I thank you that you have come to reveal yourself to us. Lord, I thank you that you don't leave us to ourselves, that you don't let us languish without knowledge or without hope, but that you took on flesh and you came and you had stories written about you so that we could read them and we could understand who you are and what you've done for us and how we ought to live. And so, God, I ask that anyone in this room who has been living their life believing that they could see on their own human strength, that you would give them a different kind of strength, a strength that allows them to humble themselves and become as a blind man, become as a beggar, that they might be given true sight, and that sight would enable them to see everything new, to see responsibilities and burdens as opportunities for the work of God to be displayed, that they would see love as the most important foundational force in the universe. Lord, we love you. We thank you for bringing us here. We thank you for bringing us to one another. We thank you for bringing us into this world through our mothers. Lord, we ask that we would honor them today. And maybe it means honoring them by drawing closer to you. Lord, we thank you for sending your son for us. It's in his name we pray. Amen.